I don't think we think in terms of 20, 25-year increments, and I think that actually comes pretty naturally to China. There was great success in integrating the world. I like this quote, where commerce doesn't cross through borders, armies do. And that was sort of what Pax Americana was built on after World War II. We didn't have to help Germany after defeating the Nazis. We didn't have to help the Japanese, but we did. America did that with West Germany, with Taiwan, with Korea, with Japan, and the result was really building up this thriving global capitalist world.
The United States, we allowed China to the World Trade Organization. We're now going to offshore to them. They're effectively the Saudi Arabia of manufacturing. We're going to get low-cost labor from them. They're going to pump out products the way Saudi pumps out oil. But it's good because we've won. It's the end of history. Francis Fukuyama, it's good. And even though they're a one-party system, they're embracing American-style capitalism, and they're going to converge with us. And we're all going to be one big happy family. But the Chinese have other designs.
China's a proud country with 5,000-year history, with a population that's 3 to 4 times the size of that of America. They were just never going to fit into the picture the way that we thought of Pax Americana. They want their own system. I do think we sort of made this historic error. We also totally took our eye off the ball. Throughout the 2000s, we could have been holding China to account and really emphasizing the spirit and the words of the World Trade Organization. But instead, the whole decade was spent on war in the Middle East and then reacting to the financial crisis. And during that time, China was just able to think about the one thing, the Nietzschean rise to power through manufacturing, and nobody was particularly paying attention. And I don't even think Apple was really paying attention until Xi Jinping sort of forces them to in March 2013.
Welcome to Open Book. I am your host, Anthony Scaramucci. Joining us now is Patrick McGee. He's the San Francisco correspondent for the Financial Times. And he's a best-selling author. The title of the book is Apple in China, The Capture of the World's Greatest Company. What a phenomenal book. And I'll just tell you, Patrick, I was at the Chalk History Festival in England. Okay, so this would be like Southwest England. I was at a table. I gave a presentation. I was at a table. There was a gentleman across from me and said, "What are you reading now?" And I said, blah, blah. And he said, "Well, you should add Apple in China to your list." And so I downloaded it on my Kindle and my Audible, and I started listening to it on the flight back home, and didn't stop listening. I thought it was probably the best. It's the best business book of the year.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll tell you that. And I tell you, and I've read a lot of really good business books. So congratulations on that. But let's go to you. You are a reporter and you write books, and you've got the New York Times and the Economist saying that this is one of the best books in the year. I'm saying I think it's the best business book of the year. So what's the formula, Patrick? We have a lot of writers that listen. What are we doing wrong as a group of writers?
Oh, that's funny. I mean, well, the premise of the book was, in a sense, to take a company that I think we all think we know because of best-selling biographies of Steve Jobs and Johnny Ive, and to a lesser degree, Tim Cook, but to be able to sort of reframe the whole story just by asking, well, how do they actually make their products? And to be honest, I think it's bizarre, and I indict myself here, along with basically every other journalist that covers Apple, because I didn't do it for 4 years, with not covering that story. I mean, I think everyone knows that Apple products are built in China, but I don't think anyone's really asked the proper questions. Well, why are they built there? What did China offer? And frankly, where was Apple building them beforehand? And also, what can we learn from Chinese industrial policy? I mean, there was just so many things that were unanswered. So, I mean, my favorite reviews of the book are people saying, like, why would I want to read a book about supply chains? Or I already know the Apple history. And then just being stunned at the level of sort of novel detail that's introduced really just in the opening pages. But then I think that cadence kind of keeps up the whole time. But to answer your question more directly, I think because the book is really interview based more than anything else, I'm asking people that worked at Apple and often were in the weeds, on the ground, actually performing the task. So it's less about sort of the grand strategy, the likes of Jeff Williams or Tim Cook. It was the people that had to enact the policies on the ground. And I probably think too many books are based on just like the top 5 or 10 people who are making the decisions and not on who's actually being deployed into the field making those decisions. And that's basically where the whole story is for my book, but it's probably the case for really any business.
Well, I mean, there's so much there. I guess what I would say that I loved about the book, in addition to everything you just said, is there's an improbable outcome here. Apple's not doing well. Emilio's got Apple on the ropes. He's trying to get Steve back to the company. Of course, people are ambivalent about Jobs coming back to the company. You know, Michael Dell, who helped me get Skybridge started, my company, always regrets saying, if you remember at Comdex, what did he say famously at Comdex in 1970? Do you remember what he said?
He was asked, what would you do if you were in charge of Apple? And he basically said, I'd sell all the factories, all the assets, and give the money to shareholders. I mean, he thought the company was dead.
He said the cash is on the balance sheet. They should. And of course, what Steve Jobs famously did is when he crossed the market capitalization of Dell, he took those statements and he put them out to all at Apple, because that was Steve's personality. And but what I mean by the book, though, is this is an improbable story. If you landed from Mars and you started the book, didn't know who Apple was, you said, okay, this company's going bankrupt. This company is in disrepair. It's got a great operating system. It's had some neat, forward-thinking technology, but the company's going bankrupt. And then these guys revitalized the company, and they returned to the ethos of what made Apple great. There's a story in the book I'd like you to recant for my viewers and listeners, if you don't mind, and that is the production of the multiple color Macintoshes and how they've got to get them up on the assembly line, and then they got to figure out which colors are going where, and how masterful that was done by these engineers.
That's funny. I've never been asked to recount this question. So how many of the details I know?
There's a reason, because I'm going to add some narrative to it. But
yeah, okay.
Tell us about what they did there.
So let me say, because this is also a Michael Dell story. So let me just say two things about Michael Dell. So one, I think the reason why Michael Dell's comments hurt Steve Jobs is really that they were accurate. I mean, he was pinpointing something that was really quite true. And I was able to sort of verify that myself, because one riddle I was trying to solve is that Steve Jobs is actually offered the Apple CEO position, a position he had never had before, right? Lots of people think he was CEO in the late 70s or early 80s. He never was. So when he's offered the Apple CEO role in July 1997, he doesn't want it. He won't take the role. And it's because he thinks the company's about to die and he doesn't want to be burdened with the death of the company. And then what changes his mind is sort of the subsequent narrative that I'll skip over for now. But that's why Michael Dell's comments hurt. Okay. Dell was the logistics champion at the time. And this sort of like is the culminating thing that happened over the course of 10 or 15 years, where the IBM PC, the whole revolution that comes out of the 1981 computer, is that Apple is being bested by companies that are not playing Steve Jobs' game. What he cares about is user interface, the graphic computer, the GUI, the graphic user interface, the usability of it all, and all that. And nobody else is playing that game. They're all doing logistics and distribution on a scale and at a sort of efficiency that Apple's unable to compete with. And that's what's going to kill the company in 96. So when Apple really gets its stuff together and begins making the first Bondi Blue transparent computer, but then a whole rainbow of colors based on the Lifesaver colors to some extent, Foxconn is able to really engineer the hell out of this and really help Apple. So they sort of out-Dell Dell. So Dell would sell a bunch of computers in the same format, but if you wanted to customize them, their distributor would have to sort of take them off the production line and then tweak them on a different production line. And Foxconn found a way to basically do all the customization on a single line. So it was a big upgrade, but it was an upgrade born out of necessity because, of course, none of the Apple computers really looked alike. You had these 5 different colors. Nobody had ever done that before. So they found ways of basically like starting the plastic injection molding only when the order was actually placed. So instead of doing like 100 blueberry computers and then 100 strawberry variants, you could just do the orders as they came. I mean, this is sort of typical in the automotive industry, but nobody had really done it for the PC industry. You didn't have to do it in the PC industry because there wasn't enough variation. Apple demanded it.
The reason I'm bringing it up is I feel like it gave the company its mojo back in terms of product design and the implementation of the product design through the supply chain, and gave them more confidence to explore other products that ultimately became the reason why they're one of the most, if not the most successful company in the world. And so that's the reason I wanted you to bring it up. But you do something else in this book, and that is you explain the People's Party. You explain the Chinese Communist Party in the book, and I'm gonna test something on you. I'd like you to either push me back or agree with me or disagree with me. So the United States, we allowed China to the World Trade Organization. We're now going to offshore to them because they're effectively the Saudi Arabia of manufacturing. We're going to get low-cost labor from them. They're going to pump out products the way Saudi pumps out oil. But it's good because we've won. It's the end of history. Francis Fukuyama, it's good. And even though they're a one-party system, they're embracing American-style capitalism, and they're going to converge with us. And we're all going to be one big happy family in the mercantilist capitalist system. But the Chinese have other designs. They end up taking the technology. You know, when I visited China in my 30s, I'm 61 now, but in my 30s, they say, okay, we want to do technology transfer. You've heard that buzzword all the time. And that's what Apple did for China. They opened the door to all of this wonderful engineering and all of this technology, and they knocked it off. And they've done things, frankly, better than we do. And by your book, I think the number was 28 million. You said that the 28 million people were trained, which is greater than the entire workforce of California. So react to that. Do I have that right? The Americans thought, hey, we'll use them as a manufacturing center. They'll never grow into a competitive economy. Or did we always think they were going to be a massive economy like they are today?
There's a lot of short-sightedness, of course, on the part of the American politicians, but also the American engineers and the Apple team in particular. I don't think we think in terms of 20, 25-year increments. And I think that actually comes pretty naturally to China. So that's one thing. But it was also that you have to remember there was great success in integrating the world. I like this quote, where commerce doesn't cross through borders, armies do. And that was sort of what Pax Americana was built on after World War II. We didn't have to help Germany after defeating the Nazis. We didn't have to help the Japanese, but we did. You know, the Brits set up Volkswagen, essentially. Volkswagen was born in Germany before the war, but it only became sort of the hippie company that we all know it to be with the rise of the Beetle and everything afterwards. And it's because the Brits went in and really trained the German factory workers and sort of kept everything going and injected capital where needed. And America did that with West Germany, with Taiwan, with Korea, with Japan. And the result was really building up this like thriving global capitalist world. We thought we were going to do the same thing with China, but China's a proud country with 5,000-year history, with a population that's 3 to 4 times the size of that of America. They were just never going to fit into the picture the way that we thought. You know, we thought they were a little puzzle piece that would fit in. They're a puzzle piece that's like bigger than the puzzle, right? Or at least half the size. And so I just think that China has a certain pride that never was going to sort of accept the terms of Pax Americana. They want their own system. And it's hard to begrudge them for that. I mean, it's kind of proper for them to think of themselves the way they think of themselves. And so I do think we sort of made this historic error. But the other thing worth knowing is that we also totally took our eye off the ball. I mean, throughout the 2000s, we could have been holding China to account and really emphasizing the spirit and the words of the World Trade Organization. But instead, the whole decade was spent on war in the Middle East and then reacting to the financial crisis. And during that time, China was just able to think about the one thing, the Nietzschean rise to power through manufacturing. And in a sense, nobody was particularly paying attention. And I don't even think Apple was really paying attention until Xi Jinping sort of forces them to in March 2013.
It's rough, though. It's a rough story because you've got a Mormon missionary. Forgive me, Patrick. I can't remember his name.
John Ford, my favorite character.
Okay, so he's going to open these stores. Okay, so this is and then you have the Gang of Eight, who is trying to figure out a way to placate the Beijing government or the Chinese government, and they're losing. They're losing. They realize that they have to do backflips for China, and they have to conform and comport to China. So much so that they're telling Jon Stewart when he joins Apple Studios or Apple Plus, you know, leave the Chinese jokes out of the equation, right? I mean, this is what's going on. So it's a Gordian knot. The story. It's a story about two people that need each other, but the Apple executives really don't understand the size and scope and the leverage that the Chinese government has over them. Do I have that wrong?
No, I think that's all right. And I think the thing that people that maybe haven't read the book but still have thoughts about what's inside the book get wrong is they'll say, well, look at the iPhone Air, right? And Apple's doing so well. It is the third world's most valuable company. Why are you saying that this is wrong? And of course, my point is not that this hasn't worked out for Apple or China. It's worked out brilliantly for both of them. But during the last 30, 40 years, we've completely hollowed out our own manufacturing capacity. We frankly have hollowed out Mexico's manufacturing capacity. And so there's all this collateral damage or negative externalities to the successful relationship. And the result is that not only is Apple reliant on Chinese high-end manufacturing, but basically all Western corporations are. And even when it comes to something like warfare, if it's going to be drones, if it's going to be other forms of gadgetry that involve fabricating semiconductors, Apple's played a large role in facilitating the transfer of knowledge on just a totally epic scale. And just to sort of throw in the number that if readers aren't familiar with it, so Apple has said in its own public documents that it's trained 28 million people since 2008. And actually, the number was updated a few months ago, and I just hadn't noticed. It's now 30 million people because they added 2.5 million, which gives you a sense of how magnificently large the workforce in hardware, sub-suppliers and suppliers working for Apple is, but also the churn, right? If you had 3 million people in the Apple supply chain, but it was only going up by 100,000 each year in terms of how many people had been trained, that would tell you that the vast majority of people are staying on every year. But actually, they're not. You tend to work for Apple. An Apple supplier for, 8, 12, 16 weeks, and then you move on to something else, and then they have to train somebody else. That's how the numbers get so ridiculously high.
I mean, it's mind-blowing when you really think about it. And I don't want to make this political, but unfortunately, there's a little bit of politics in this, and that is the politics, in my opinion, of irresponsibility. And so whatever you think of Donald Trump, there is some kernels of truth in what he's saying.
Certainly.
That over the last 30 years, we sort of abdicated our manufacturing. We offshored into places that have made it, I guess, suspect from a national security perspective. One, do you agree with that? And then two, what should we do about it now?
So I absolutely agree with that. I like to say that I have a no villains narrative. I mean, if I introduce Tim Cook a few chapters in, it's not a negative portrait. It's an understanding of him being this master of minutiae who, yes, is the opposite of Steve Jobs in certain ways, but they have some similarities where you can see how they would really work together. A total zero tolerance for B players, an obsessiveness over details where Steve Jobs might be in the product conception, but Tim Cook is in the operations, how it all gets done, right? Pages and pages and pages of Excel sheets where everybody's going through every number to make sure that it's all going on the trajectory that I want it to go on. Look, if there's an indictment, it's not really of Apple per se. I mean, the history is really a series of defendable, rational decisions. It's just where they all sort of culminate and where they all end up. But if there's an indictment of something, it's not Apple, it's shareholder first capitalism. Really an idea that comes out of Milton Friedman and the University of Chicago in the 70s and 80s and gets embraced, I guess initially by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, but really I think is later embraced by Bill Clinton and a whole host of other people. It really becomes the American consensus. Where we are now is so tricky because I'm like this, happy-go-lucky, golden retriever Canadian, and yet the book is pretty pessimistic. I mean, I just don't think we're going to compete with China in terms of manufacturing anytime soon. And so, my advice to the administration is that, take India as a win. I get it that it's perfect if you can decouple from China and the jobs go back to a district where, you need more votes and such, but just decoupling from China alone is a win. So if you can get stuff made in India or made in Mexico, that's sort of good enough, as it were. So I highly disagree with the idea that if it's going to India, we're not benefiting. I think we are, because we do care about the global order, not just the 50 states. So there's that. The other thing is just a recognition of all the ways in which the jobs just aren't going to come back here. I mean, Zhengzhou alone, what Apple calls iPhone City, has 400,000 people assembling iPhones. There's just no place in America where that's remotely even close to happening, and it's never going to happen. Maybe you could talk about special economic zones where people that are fleeing Honduras wanted to get over the Trumpian wall and need a job in a desperate place or in a desperate situation. Maybe they could go set some special economic zones where that kind of work could be done. But I don't hear anything about that sort of thing. So I think the quicker we realize that the jobs aren't coming back to America, the more we're going to have practical policies in place. And so unless you want China being absolutely dominant and even more dominant into the future, then I think we need to be supporting efforts in Mexico and in India. Some of it should be in the United States, to be clear, but the whole gamut is not going to be there. And I don't like the idea that that has to be the answer, because it's such a fanciful answer that it's just never going to happen. You're just setting yourself up for failure.
So listen, it's very well said, and you make these points in the book brilliantly. Let's go to the apple squeeze, as you call it. What is the apple squeeze? Explain it to us, and what's the significance of it?
Yeah, this might be the sort of biggest contribution to Apple history in the book. And it sort of takes place in a slow burn way until eventually I coin it the Apple squeeze. But if I go back in history a little bit, it's Terry Guo of Foxconn. He founds this, Taiwanese assembly giant in 1974. And he is the first person to really understand that working with Apple is ridiculously difficult because of the challenge of their aesthetics and the demand for no tolerance in the engineering, etc. But he understands that the challenge is the opportunity, because in order to get to Apple quality levels, Apple will train your entire workforce to get there. And so, yes, they have these ruthless negotiators that really negotiate the hell out of a deal. So your company's really not going to be paid very much. But the intangible payment of the training, right? The sort of tuition-free, on-the-ground, hardware equivalent of Ivy League training that's going on, that's the value. And I don't think the Chinese suppliers really get that writ large until 2016. And the value of this is massive for Apple politically, because when Xi Jinping comes into power in 2013, really goes after Apple through the CCTV. So this is a big episode where Apple gets scolded for 3 continuous weeks, where they really worry that they're going to be blacklisted like Facebook or Google. They're worried about all their operations in the country, plus a $20 billion business that they built up at the time. And the Apple squeeze is Apple's argument to Beijing, which is, it's true that loads of suppliers are being treated in a really dictatorial way, and they're not getting much money out of it. But you don't understand. We're training the hell out of hundreds of factories across the country. So no, we don't have a technical joint venture where sort of half the company is Apple, half the company is Chinese, and they're learning the ins and outs. But while Samsung has maybe 35 of those relationships, we have hundreds of relationships where we're training up all these factories. And the result of those factories training is that they are going on to then use those skill sets, right? Use that machinery in some cases, and they are supplying to Huawei, to Oppo, to Vivo, to Xiaomi, etc. And so my argument is essentially that Apple ends up being the biggest supporter of Made in China 2025, which is Xi Jinping's ambitious plan to sever dependence on the West. That's sort of an extraordinary claim. I think it's pretty well backed up in the book. And so just to simplify greatly, the Apple squeeze is, we're not going to pay you much, but we're going to train the hell out of your entire workforce.
And it's going to lead to tremendous amounts of positive externalities for the Chinese government and the Chinese workforce and disposable income in China. So it worked out really well.
Yes.
I mean, again, it worked out really well for China. So let's go to Tim Cook. What's the legacy of Tim Cook?
Well, the conclusion
He gets a lot of
is,
passes. I mean, we're just going to be honest, okay? He gets a lot of passes due to his demeanor. He gets the benefit of the doubt from a lot of people. What's his legacy?
So I say that the legacy is unwritten. And it's in part because I'm trying to be fair, and it's in part because I don't know the future. I mean, in the event that China annexes Taiwan, and therefore TSMC is no longer able to produce chips that are used in every Apple product you can think of, and you have no iPhone for the next couple of years, I mean, then Tim Cook's legacy would deeply be put into question, because he, more than anyone else, is the person who consolidated operations into both China and Taiwan, right? China for sort of everything and Taiwan for chips. But I don't know that that's going to happen, right? And so, one could see that Tim Cook continues to have the sort of legacy he has today, which is some sort of demigod of capitalism, right? When Apple became worth $3 trillion, I sort of stunned myself and then stunned readers of the Financial Times by calculating that the value added in terms of market cap was $700 million a day from when he became CEO in 2011 to the first trading day of 2023. So there's all sorts of reasons to believe that he is just an exceptional CEO, and, a worthy successor to Steve Jobs. But of course, what I worry about is that the decisions he has made have actually been pretty detrimental to Washington and to America standing on the world stage. But I'm writing the narrative a little too early to conclusively state that. I don't know how things are going to pan out. But my comparison is that of Jack Welch, who was named Manager of the Century by Fortune magazine in 2001 for leading GE for 20 years, from 81 to 2001. And then, the biography of him 5 years ago is called The Man Who Broke Capitalism. That's
David
quite
Gallup,
a downfall. And I worry about that same thing happening for Tim Cook.
Yeah, I interviewed David, and I think there's a lot to be true, but there's a revision always later on of how a person is thought of. I guess the one thing I was dying to interview because I wanted you to react to this is because you say there's no chance that the iPhone is ever going to be made in the United States, and I believe that. Is there something going on, though, where they're resting on their laurels a little bit? Meaning, my iPhone 14, which is 3 or 4 years ago, is a great product. I'm saying it isn't. The 17 that I just purchased. Look, I'm an Apple file. I own an Apple Watch, an Apple, 2 iPhones, several iPads. I'm talking to you from an Apple Mac.
Yeah.
So I'm an Apple person, but it's been a gradualism of innovation. There's really been no brand new products. I look at Samsung or even what Huawei's done in mainland China. They seem to have been more innovative. If I'm wrong about that, push back on me. But I feel like they don't have that innovation spark that they had under Steve Jobs. Am I wrong?
No, I agree with you. And I would say, Johnny Ive left Apple in 2019, and the office of Chief Design Officer remains vacant. I mean, that is a devastating thing to even just sort of digest.
Right.
6 years without a chief design officer for a company that, is a whole sort of section at the Museum of Modern Art. I mean, the things that they've created have been absolutely phenomenal. And I do think that they are resting on their laurels, to quote you. The nuance here is that Steve Jobs was the product visionary of the last century, and he was the person who appointed Tim Cook. In other words, I don't think that was Tim Cook's role to play. His role was to sort of take what Steve Jobs had already done, continue to iterate them on an annual basis, but really just ramp up the scale and the distribution around the world. I would say by 2023, it was mission accomplished, and Apple sort of realized that the pendulum had begun to swing in the other direction. And so the criticism of Tim Cook, I think, has always been tired until now, because now, in fact, you do have companies, OpenAI, Perplexity, a whole host of companies that are doing things that are really innovative in the product space, really innovative with artificial intelligence. And whatever the qualities of Tim Cook are, product design, product vision, and AI are not among them. And I worry that with him at the helm, they don't have someone to play that role. And so I would actually call for a new CEO of Apple.
And you'd want somebody more innovative or more execution-oriented? Who would you want?
Yeah, more product-focused. I don't think you need someone who's execution-oriented. That's baked into the entity that is Apple.
They've got that figured out.
Yeah,
okay, so
absolutely.
we're down to what I call my 5 words. My producer and I, Holly, we pick 5 words from your book, and then we ask the author to give us a 1, 2, or 3 sentences, sort of the first thing comes to your head. Okay? So if I say the word China, Patrick, you say what?
Competent, ruthless, authoritarian, long-term oriented, and creative.
All of those things, and eventually self-sufficient, self-contained.
Yeah, in a scary way. Yeah.
I think they're going to get there, and I think the West is going to be like, whoa, we put the Frankenstein monster on the table, we gave a little bit of electricity into the bolts, and that thing is getting bigger than us. Am I right?
Yeah. Okay,
let's go to America. So I mean the United States of America, and since you're a Canadian, let's say North America.
Innovative. Divisive. What I mean by divisive is polarized. The politics far too polarized. Straitjacket comes to mind.
It's an uneducated workforce, though, no?
Yeah, there's a better word for that, though. I mean, decadent, I think I would go with.
Okay.
Right, we don't have the same hunger that Apple found in the Chinese workers 25 years ago, and I think continues to find today. And in a kind of neutral way, I'm saying decadent. We're just at a stage of capitalism where we just don't have people that will, quote unquote, eat bitterness the way that Xi Jinping is advocating.
You know, there's a great economic concept called the paradox of early progress. So hear me out for a second. So we build the first airports. So that's great. Now we're flying around. Other people are not flying around. But now the airport was built in 1930. And so we keep layering on a 1930 airport. The Chinese build an airport in 2025. It's gleaming. It's got great Wi-Fi. It's got great cellular connectivity. It's got great rails. But it's the paradox of early progress, right? We're layering on top of something that's 100 years old, and they're starting de novo, and it's very hard to compete with that.
I think that's the military problem right now. We're sort of adding in AI systems and so forth, whereas the Chinese are sort of building them carte blanche. That gives them quite the advantage.
Yeah, so I just wonder from a policy perspective, if we need to scrap some certain things and just here's how we would do things without these legacy systems in place. But that's another podcast for your next book on how we're going to return America to its vitality.
You're okay. Closer to the truth than you realize.
Okay, let's go to Tim Cook.
I think he's competence incarnate.
Yep.
Hardworking. I have to put these two together as ethical, but blind. Mr. Spreadsheet. And I got to throw in that he's a bit cold.
In a good way, cold?
Well, I suppose it can be in a good way. He doesn't lose his shit. But no, he's kind of the cold, calculating, unempathetic type.
Well, you know, I mean, some have called him Tim Apple, right? And I think he's been masterful as Tim Apple. Because just think about it for a second. He's a guy that, I don't know, probably was in love with many of Trump's ideas and many of Trump's things that he does. But he's in there. He's given him gold. He gave him that 24 karat gold platform, that podium and stuff. I don't know. You tell me. Am I wrong?
I mean, the fantasy press release that if I could wake up to that would just please me to no end would be that Tim Cook has resigned from Apple and is realizing how much America needs to do and that he has a certain skill set that could really help. And so that he ends up heading Doge. I think that would be fantastic.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, you never know in this country. That's the great thing about the country. All right. Last word. I'm going to give you the last word. I say the word Apple. You say what?
I don't have a creative answer here. Honestly, the term that's coming to mind is just China, which is no good for the author of Apple in China. I'm not all that bearish on Apple. It's not that I want to say lack of innovation or something like that. I think the last week's press release and performance, the two phones was a pretty good one, at least
me too.
In the judgment of the last 5 years. I don't know what I say for Apple.
I mean, look, the phone's camera sensational.
But captured is probably the best word I could say.
Yeah, you know, when I hear Apple, I hear large, and I hear cumbersome now, and I can't channel Steve Jobs because I'm just not as smart as him. But I'm wondering if he would want to dent Apple some way. You know, if he would want to put the cardiac clamps on Apple and shock it a little bit into some shake some things loose. Who the hell knows? I mean, one of the things that you said in the book, which I found brilliant about Jobs, is that when he got back to Apple, I think he was more focused on the engineers. I think he was more focused on team building. He also shot their most successful product, right? He took the iPod, which is helping the country grow and revolutionize the music system. Boom. He shot it and put it in the phone. You know, a lot of guys wouldn't have done that. They wouldn't have had the guts to do that, you know? And so I have a huge admiration for him. This is a phenomenal book, by the way, and I congratulate you for writing it. The title of the book is Apple in China, the Capture of the World's Greatest Company. But it's more than about this company. It's about the last 3 decades of American business decision-making, American political policy, and the unsuspecting rise of China. It seems like a fait accompli now, but it didn't feel that way in the 90s. So many of these people that were making these decisions, and you very aptly point that out in the book. So I applaud you for writing it, and thank you so much for coming on the show today.
My pleasure, Anthony.
Washington stood morally head and shoulders above them and above everybody else. He's also seen as somebody who set aside personal interest to take up command of the Continental Army. He agreed to serve without pay, and in fact, he lost a lot of money as a result of the American Revolution. He lost a lot of money from the time he spent as president of the United States, but he was willing to do that. It really had to do with this code of honor that Washington established for himself. So this is how an honorable man behaves. He puts the interests of his country ahead of the interests of himself. He was a master of silence. He was surrounded by people who were just in love with their own voices. And so Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, everybody at the Constitutional Convention of 1787, this is a whole bunch of lawyers and politicos who go and they meet in this room for 4 months during the summer of 1787, and they're debating. And Washington is sitting there, but he says not a word. And precisely because he is so silent, people think he must be deeper than he is. He knows more than he is saying. They all sort of lowered themselves to the same level of competing voices, whereas Washington's silence put him above them.
Welcome to Open Book. Joining us today is best-selling author, award-winning historian H.W. Brands. The title of the book, American Patriarch, and it's the life of George Washington. And what a great book. And Professor, I have to tell you, I am a huge fan of yours. I've read several of your books. Most recently, and you wrote it a while back, Traitor to His Class. What a great title that was, too. And this is also a great title. But these are consequential figures. Roosevelt, wrote about Reagan, of course, Ben Franklin. Why George Washington now?
Well, I confess that I was aware that America was approaching its 250th anniversary of independence, and there would be interest in the people who got it all started. Except I'd been thinking about Washington for a long time. I've written around Washington. I've never been writing directly on Washington as the subject of a biography. And part of it was I just couldn't quite figure him out. So I thought finally I would take a shot at it.
Did you figure him out, sir?
I think so.
So what did you figure out? Go ahead. Tell me about the man that I was told could never tell a lie, who told his dad that he chopped down the cherry tree, the father of our country. It's such a great title, by the way. We'll get to the rationale behind the title, but tell me who I should be thinking of when I hear George Washington and what I learned about when I was in kindergarten.
So Benjamin Franklin, a contemporary of Washington's, was often called the archetype of the self-made American. In some ways, Washington was the same sort of approach. Ended up with a different product, but Washington became the person he thought he should be. As a young man, he developed this sense of the kind of reputation he wanted to have. He was ambitious, but he didn't know exactly what his ambition was for. He was also, and this is very significant, he was well off. He was a member of the Virginia gentry, and I spent some time in the book talking about what this meant, who these people were. And it was a class of people that lived, well, in large part by the labor of other people, including their slaves. But it was also a class that lived by a code of honor. And for them, the respect of others, the admiration of others was a really big deal. And Washington, he wasn't the eldest child. He wasn't going to be the inheritor of the big estate. He was going to have to make something of himself. And what he decided to make of himself was this person that people could look up to, that he himself could look up to. So he had this idea of the kind of character he wanted to be. He wanted to be admired. He wanted to be respected. And the way to do that was to do the things that would make people admire you and respect you. And so he set for himself this model of the person he wanted to be. And to a large extent, that's the person he became.
When I think about these figures, whether it's Jackson, Grant, FDR, Reagan, I feel like all of these figures were influenced by Washington. Am I right to think that?
Yeah, except that I'm not sure how deeply they were influenced by Washington and what aspect of him. If you're going to be a president, and I've written on several presidents, you're aware that Washington is the first and the one who set many of the precedents. I think that if you were after Washington, though, there are things that you could model yourself on, but they probably wouldn't get you to where you wanted to go in politics. Because one of the points that I make in the book is that Washington helped create the American Republic. And it had a style of politics. Were competitive. Sometimes they were often partisan and bitter and nasty. Washington himself would not have thrived in that political realm if Washington had had to run for president. If he had had to compete for the presidency, he never would have done it because that was not his style. Politics was not his milieu. He was a soldier. He was a military commander. He was really good at that. He was comfortable in that realm. He became president upon the urging of everybody he knew, saying, you got to be our first president, because they were looking for a big name. They were looking for somebody who had a reputation, who could get this new government and the Constitution off to a good start. And he did that. And as soon as he could reasonably get away, he did. He had no desire to stick around and accrue additional power.
You know, I the reason I say this is sort of about this ethos of service and an ethos to the commitment of keeping the country together. I mean, we can talk about where we are today in our history, but I felt like when I finished your book and took a deep breath, I said, what is this about? This was about a man who obviously wanted the respect of the people around him, but wanted to be remembered for service with a level of selflessness to it, right? You know, we all talk about Cincinnatus when we talk about Washington, and we all talk about his willingness to leave power, right? Isn't it important to assume power, be responsible for it, Bill, but then also to be willing to leave power, right? And these are the things that we learn from Washington, right?
Well, Washington gets credit for having served 2 terms as president and then leaving, setting aside power. There's nothing in the Constitution. There was nothing in habit or norm at that point that said you had to leave after 2 terms. I mean, today, still, members of the House of Representatives can serve forever. Members of the Senate can serve forever. Under the original Constitution, the president could serve forever, but Washington didn't. And he's often credited for having this sense of selflessness that you refer to. I think in this case, that's overstated because Washington was not attracted to political power. Other people were. Later presidents would be, but Washington wasn't. Now here I have to say something that probably requires saying to a modern audience, an audience that's used to the idea that the presidency of the United States is the most powerful political office in the world, and that the person who is president has enormous power and of course wouldn't want to give it up. But the presidency back in Washington's day, when he became the first president, it was no big deal. The United States had had presidents before Washington, but nobody's ever heard of them because the presidents under the Articles of Confederation in the Congress were almost irrelevant. They were simply presiding officers over the Congress. So this new president, it was a new thing. But Washington, even if it had been a bigger deal, Washington himself had no attraction to political power. What he really wanted to do was get back to Mount Vernon and go back to his farm.
Again, there's so much in the book and so much, frankly, I have to confess, I see myself as a student of history, but I missed a lot. So I'm gonna say a few things to you and get your reaction to them, and you'll tell me whether if I got it right. I feel like you have these 2 non-politicians, Washington and Alexander Hamilton, and they form one of the great political partnerships in American history, right? There's almost like a father-son dynamic. One is a striver, one is an aristocrat. I guess the question I have for you, sir, is there a Washington without Hamilton?
Oh, there would have been Washington without Hamilton, because if it hadn't been Hamilton, it would have been somebody else. Washington was a powerful figure, and people were drawn to him because he had power. Hamilton was one, but there were others. The Marquis de Lafayette was another one, and who came from a very different background than Hamilton. You identified this very important relationship, and you're absolutely right. Hamilton was the striver. Hamilton was the one who came from nothing. He had intelligence, he had ambition, but he had no springboard. He had no start. And so everything he got, he had to win for himself. And what he saw in Washington, first of all, was an opportunity to get on the ladder and to rise from the ladder. It's hard. I have a hard time understanding what's really moving Hamilton, because I have a great deal of difficulty separating Hamilton's ambition from Hamilton's emotions. Now, it was that ambition that got him to where he wanted to go. But there came a point when, this is very much like Hamilton, although it sounds pretty bold for somebody as young as he was, and he was very bold. Hamilton felt that he outgrew Washington, and that Washington, he helped get Washington the presidency, and now Washington made him the Secretary of the Treasury, and he's going to propose all these ideas. It's going to make the executive branch really strong and powerful. But Washington isn't as enthusiastic as he is, and eventually Hamilton decides to bail out of the administration so he can essentially go off into politics on his own.
Thank you for tuning in to Open Book. And if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button below so that you're the first to know when our new episodes drop each week. We got a lot more coming. And now back to the show. Yeah, I guess the reason I asked the question the way I did was what I learned from you is, he's considered to be one of the key architects of the financial system and the structure of the system. But I feel like Washington lent his support and prestige to him and sort of chose that model over the Jeffersonian or the Madison model. And so I guess let me reframe the question. Why do you think Washington did that? Because those other two thinkers were more towering, in my opinion, than Hamilton.
So part of it had to do with the fact that Washington was no Democrat in a small d. He didn't believe that ordinary people had the capacity to govern themselves. He was an aristocrat as president. And it's one of the reasons the Washington model has limited value for subsequent presidents who preside in an age of democracy. So Washington was looking for those institutions, those developments that would give greater energy to the executive branch. Now, Hamilton was a very keen thinker on economics, on finance, on banking, and all this stuff. Washington was not. Washington knew how this stuff worked, generally speaking. But here again, it's worth taking ourselves back in time to an age before there were banks. There were almost no banks in the United States, so nobody knew what banks did. And Washington hardly had any dealings at all with banks. When he needed money, he borrowed money from his agents in London, and he worked through that. But through the banks, he was willing to take Hamilton's word on a lot of this stuff. Washington was not a student of economics, a student of financial institutions, but he did have great faith in Hamilton, in Hamilton's intellect. I don't know how much he trusted Hamilton's judgment or even Hamilton's character, but he found that Hamilton was a very useful subordinate, a useful lieutenant, because he was smart, he was a quick study, he would do things, fast, and he'd get all sorts of things done.
Again, this is us looking back on Washington, all these things named after him. I grew up in a town called Port Washington. It was named after the general. Apparently he quartered some troops there. I don't know if it's true or not, but so they named it after him. But I feel like you left me with this impression that his contemporaries saw him as this towering, we see him as a towering figure, but I feel like his contemporaries did. So I want you to role play for me, if you don't mind, Bill. Be a contemporary of Washington and describe him in the words that his fellow contemporaries would have thought of him at that time.
Nearly all of them thought that Washington stood morally head and shoulders above them and above everybody else. Benjamin Franklin was an exception to this. And again, here's something worth noting. Washington was a generation older than nearly all the other founders. Actually, he was a generation younger than Benjamin Franklin, but those two, they were very much older. And this is one of the reasons he is seen as this father figure, but he's also seen as somebody who set aside personal interest to take up command of the Continental Army. He agreed to serve without pay. And in fact, he lost a lot of money as a result of the American Revolution. He lost a lot of money from the time he spent as president of the United States, but he was willing to do that. And it really had to do with this code of honor that Washington established for himself that I mentioned earlier. So this is how an honorable man behaves. He puts the interests of his country ahead of the interests of himself. And he carried that off. And the fact that he does it by design doesn't make it any less sincere. This is a standard to which he holds himself. Now, there were some other traits of Washington, some of his habits that made him seem above everybody else. He was a master of silence. He was surrounded by people who were just in love with their own voices. And so Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, everybody at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. This is a whole bunch of lawyers and politicos who go and they meet in this room for 4 months during the summer of 1787, and they're debating. And Washington is sitting there. He's the presiding officer of the convention, but he says not a word. And precisely because he is so silent, people think he must be deeper than he is. He knows more than he is saying. And we're just around here. They all sort of lowered themselves to the same level of competing voices, whereas Washington's silence put him, it seemed, above them.
There's a hard chapter in this book, by the way, and you were unsparing in this chapter. This is the chapter on slavery. When I read the chapter, first of all, I was impressed with the detailed research that you did. Tell us a little bit about that, and tell us how do we hold these two facts together without excusing Washington, but also without, flattening him. And we have this towering magisterial figure and this slave owner. Tell us about how you handled it in the book, which I think you frankly did brilliantly, sir.
Well, one of the things I will say is I write history in order to make the people of the past understandable to people in the present. And the way I do this is to show the world through their eyes. So this is what Washington was thinking. This was Washington was saying. This is what Washington was doing. I make a point, in contrast to many other historians, I make a point of not standing in judgment over my characters. I will tell you, the readers, I'll tell you what he did, what he thought, what he had. If you want to make a judgment, you can. I'm not going to. And so I'm going to give you enough information so you can make whatever judgment you want. But in answer to this question, we've got this towering figure on the one hand and a slaveholder on the other hand. And I would say that in Washington's day, those two were inseparable. If Washington had not been a slave owner, he would not have achieved what he achieved. And the reason I say this is that if you lived in Virginia in the 1770s, 80s, and you were a person of means, as he was, then you had slaves in your workforce. If you were a big planter, they worked in your fields. If you were a gentleman who didn't have much property, they still were your servants. That's what the labor force consisted of. And if you had decided that, okay, this is immoral and I got to end it, and you decided you're going to turn your back, you're going to free all your slaves, and you would have nothing to do with the institution of slavery, then the political institutions of Virginia would have nothing to do with you. You would have been seen as an eccentric, as a crazy person, a person who could not be trusted. And so you can't have the one without the other. And that's simply a function of the times. Now, Washington himself, as far as I can tell, as a young man, in particular before the American Declaration of Independence, because this is a critical moment, thought very little about slavery as a moral question. This is just the way the world worked. The world has good stuff in it. The world has bad stuff in it. We get sick. We die. There are wars. There are plagues. There's all this stuff. Slavery is on the negative side. But Washington and many others would have seen it as a necessary evil. We can't run the economy of Virginia without slaves. So there it is. Nobody wants to be a slave who's not a slave, but nobody wants to die early either. So there's that part of it. But once the United States establishes a republic, once Washington's fellow Virginian, Thomas Jefferson, in the Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal and highlights the fact that Americans are fighting for their freedom. And Washington himself says that unless we stand up for our rights, we will be no better than slaves. And when I first read this from Washington's hand, I thought, gee, George, that's awfully rich. You're talking about you being enslaved by the tax policies of Britain. You own the slaves, guy. You really know what slavery is. And at first I thought this was just kind of a figure of speech or something. But what he really meant was that we will not be the masters of our own destiny. And just as real slaves are not masters of their own destinies. Yeah, the essence of slavery was you don't get to decide what you will do. And Washington was saying Americans would not get to decide what they would do if they failed to resist these illegitimate British laws. So anyway, but once the United States begins fighting for its freedom, Washington realizes the contradiction. He's not alone. He realized the contradiction between slavery and this freedom that they're fighting for. I'll add something else here. Before American independence, it was not within the legal or political capacity of Americans to end slavery because they lived under British law, and British law was made far away in London, and the British had no desire to emancipate the slaves in the Western Hemisphere. But now that Americans could, and Americans did, start freeing their slaves, state by state. Pennsylvania went first in 1780 and the other northern states. Washington hoped that Virginia would come to that. It was a bigger deal for Virginia. There were a lot more slaves, and slaves are more central to the economy. But Washington was trying to figure out how he could get out from under the slave system. He couldn't do it as long as he was president, because for the reasons that I said, if he came out against slavery, then he would lose all of his credibility among the very important slaveholders in Virginia and the other southern states. But after he retired, in fact, even while he was president thinking about retiring, he was trying to figure out how he could eliminate slavery as a part of the way he operated his system. Now, with Washington, there's an important complication. This comes out in his will, because he decides that he's going to free his slaves upon his demise, except that his wife, Martha, was really the owner of most of the slaves at Mount Vernon, except even technically she wasn't the owner. She was the trustee of the slaves for the children of her first husband. And so if Washington had wanted to free most of the slaves in Mount Vernon, he didn't legally have the power to do it. Neither did Martha, because of the will of her first husband. So he did what he could. He freed the slaves that he owned himself, not upon his death, but upon Martha's death, because there was going to be this very difficult complication if half the slaves at Mount Vernon became free and the other half remained slave. The ones who remained slave, they would be sorely tempted to join the free ones and flee the place, and Martha would have to deal with that mess.
You know, listen, the book is fascinating on so many different levels, and you explain to us why he is so consequential in the actual survival of the country and the formation of the republic. My last question before I get to the 5 words, and this is not a political one, sir. This is just more of an observation. So you don't have to, I'm not asking for politics. If Washington were to walk into the Oval Office today, what would he recognize about the presidency? And again, I'm talking about the institution of the presidency and the powers associated with the presidency. So what would he recognize about the presidency? And what would he not recognize or potentially be horrified by? And again, I'm overemphasizing this, but to make the point, not political, just more about how the presidency evolved and the powers associated with it.
He would be absolutely amazed, and he might be appalled at the strength of the presidency. Because under the Constitution that Washington helped write, the presidency appears only in Article 2 of the Constitution. Congress is in Article 1.
Right.
And so Congress was going to take the lead. Congress was going to have the initiative in American politics, which it did during Washington's life, and for another 100 years. It's really only in the 20th century that the executive branch jumps to the front. So he would have been surprised at how powerful the president has become, and he really would have been appalled at how weak the Congress has become. Because the whole idea was to have this government really of the people, not just this one person, but the ones they elected representatives. So he would have been stunned at that. He would have been probably equally appalled at the fact that, I mean, as we speak, there are American soldiers stationed all around the world, and America is fighting wars in distant lands. He was the one who, in his farewell address, said to his fellow Americans, don't get overly involved in the affairs of other countries. Precisely. Yep. So Washington would have acknowledged the world changes, but the idea that somehow the United States would feel it incumbent on itself, that presidents would feel it incumbent on themselves to engage in wars halfway around the world, this really would have taken him by surprise.
Okay, so we're at the point in the show, sir, where my producers and I took 5 words out of your book, and I took a little bit of liberty here because I've read some of your other books, so I've added a few words from not necessarily the book. Okay, so the first, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say the words, and then you give me a sentence or two. Okay, you ready?
Sure.
All right, so let's start with Teddy Roosevelt.
Okay, and when I say something about Teddy Roosevelt, does it have to do anything with George Washington?
It just has to do with you and your work.
Okay, actually, I will say this. Teddy Roosevelt greatly admired George Washington. And Teddy Roosevelt imagined that he could become a president as consequential as George Washington.
Franklin Roosevelt.
Franklin Roosevelt knew full well when he ran for president in 1940 that he was breaking the unwritten rule that Washington had established. And he did not do it as a way of showing disrespect for Washington. Instead, he saw it as a way of safeguarding the United States during this crisis that was coming with the Second World War.
Well, I mean, in that book, Traitor to His Class, I thought you did a brilliant job of explaining that dilemma and also explaining some of the Democratic adversaries that Roosevelt had that he had to work through before he got himself back up to the nomination.
I mean, one of the things to bear in mind, and this has to do with why we do have a 22nd Amendment. Writing into the Constitution, they only get 2 terms. It wasn't simply the Republicans, the other party, that was upset that Franklin Roosevelt never left the White House. It was fellow Democrats, because they had been patiently waiting their turn. You know, you get two administrations, 2 terms, but then you got to step aside so other deserving Democrats can have a shot.
There's a great scene in that book that you wrote. I mean, and Susan Dunn also references it in her book, where him and Farley, you know, Farley thinks he's going to be the president.
Yeah.
And Roosevelt's, let's just put it this way, he's wicked mad at him. It's off the phone with him, and he's
part of the problem is that Roosevelt was saying the same thing to Jack Garner, who was the vice president. He's letting them both think they're going to be the next president. And neither one was.
You did a really good job in that book of explaining the enigmatic personality of Mr. Roosevelt and how he was able to play people against each other. But I really love that book. All right, Ronald Reagan,
in some ways, was to the modern Republican Party what George Washington was to the American Republic. Because Ronald Reagan was this figure when he was president during the 1980s and for 10 or 15 years after there, that this was the guy who represents the best of what the Republicans can put in the presidency. And for a long time, you know, Ronald Reagan was the touchstone of American Republican politics. Things have changed now. So the Republican Party has moved on past Reagan. And in some ways, I mean, of course, American politics moved past George Washington. So we still pay lip service to George Washington, although we don't do things the way Washington did. And Republicans and other Americans today still pay lip service to Reagan, but do things very differently.
Okay. Benjamin Franklin.
Benjamin Franklin was one of the 2, George Washington being the other indispensable men of the American Revolution. Washington handled the military front. He was commanding general of the Continental Army. Franklin handled the diplomatic front. He was the one who got the all-important alliance with France that made Washington's work a whole lot easier than it would have been without it.
And their relationship, sir, how would you describe their relationship?
They spent very little time together. They ran into each other only officially. So they didn't have a friendship, but they had a great deal of respect. And the correspondence that I get between Franklin in Paris and Washington in the battlefield, when Franklin is sending people who want to volunteer to join Washington's army. And Washington is sometimes saying, thanks for these good people you're sending over, sometimes saying, wait, you're sending over too many, we can't use them. But when Franklin introduces the Marquis de Lafayette, you know, so take care of this young guy. And he's the one who introduces Lafayette to Washington. And that becomes a wonderful relationship, both for Washington and Lafayette, and for the United States, indeed for France too.
Okay, I'm going to give you the last word, and my last 2 words are George Washington. So give us a few sentences as we close the book, The American Patriarch. What are we to think of our founder?
George Washington, above all the other people of his generation, got this country off to a really good start. Without Washington, it might have happened, but it would have happened differently. It probably would have happened slower. We're 250 years out from what Washington accomplished. And we've managed to keep this experiment, self-government, going for 250 years. And if wherever Washington might be, looking down on us for wherever, just out of respect to him, we need to do our best to keep this experiment going.
Yeah. See, I think that's the reason you wrote this book. Okay. And I think you picked this subject and you timed it for this anniversary because you want to give people a message from 250 years ago, how sacred the place is, and to be reminded of the types of people that helped form it so that we can try to get back to some of that and keep it together. How much of that do I have right?
Well, if it does have that effect, I will be greatly satisfied.
Well, it had that effect on me. And so the title of the book, American Patriarch, The Life of George Washington by H.W. Brands, award-winning historian and it's just a phenomenal read. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you'll come back for your next work.
Okay. Thanks, Anthony.